As I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Dad can't even afford a real lawyer. He's probably here to beg for more time." Her husband laughed, and so did the relatives sitting behind them. I didn't say a word. I quietly took my seat and waited. Just as the judge was about to begin the hearing, the courtroom doors swung open. A sharply dressed woman walked straight toward me, placed a leather briefcase on the table, and said, "My apologies for the delay, Your Honor. I'm here to represent my client." In an instant, every smile on my daughter's face disappeared. "I'm so grateful you chose to spend this time with me. While you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country?" I read every single one. This story contains fictional elements added for narrative and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The lesson, however, is worth keeping. Every Sunday I made the same mistake. I told myself it would be different. That maybe this week Diana would save me a seat closer to the middle of the table, or Richard would put down his phone long enough to ask how my knee was holding up. I'd iron my shirt, walk the 50 yards from the guest house to the main house, and step through those glass doors carrying a dish. I'd spent 2 hours making Maggie's cornbread, the recipe she'd written in her careful looping handwriting on an index card I kept folded in my wallet. Every Sunday I was wrong. The dining table in Richard and Diana's River Oaks home was 11 feet long. I know because I measured it once out of boredom while Richard was on a call. 11 feet of Brazilian walnut custom-built, capable of seating 14 people. On Sunday evenings, only 4 of us sat there. Richard at one end, Diana at the other, Connor somewhere in the middle, and me at the far corner, tucked against the window like a piece of furniture they hadn't decided where to store. "The Austin numbers came in this morning," Richard said, cutting into his steak without looking up from his phone. He was wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, his cufflinks still on. Richard Mercer was the kind of man who dressed for dinner even when dinner was at home. 42 units pre-sold. 42 Diana, before we've even poured the 3rd floor. Diana lifted her wine glass and smiled across the length of the table at him. She was wearing a cream blouse that probably cost more than my monthly utilities, and her hair was done the way it always was, on Sundays, too perfect for a family dinner, like she was expecting photographers. "I told you the rooftop terrace would close deals," she said. "People in Austin want to feel like they're buying a lifestyle, not just square footage. The lifestyle is the square footage." Richard finally set his phone face down on the table, which meant he was about to say something he wanted witnessed. "We're looking at a 9-figure exit on this project, Di. Conservative estimate. This time next year we won't be having Sunday dinners in Houston." Diana laughed light bright, the laugh of a woman who had already spent the money in her mind. I looked down at my plate. My cornbread sat in the center of the table in the ceramic dish Maggie had bought at a street fair in Galveston back in 1998. Nobody had touched it. Diana had set out a breadbasket with sourdough from the bakery on Westheimer, and Richard's assistant had apparently sent over some kind of imported butter. So my cornbread sat there untouched and cooling like a guest who hadn't been introduced. Grandpa. Connor's voice came from 2 seats to my left. He was 17, broad-shouldered from football, with Maggie's eyes that particular shade of gray that looked green in certain light. He was the only person at this table who looked at me when he spoke. "You coming to the game Friday? We're playing St. Thomas. Big one." My chest loosened a little. "St. Thomas, huh? Their defensive line gave y'all trouble last year, if I remember right." Connor grinned. "We've been working on it. Coach has us running a new Connor." Richard's voice landed flat and heavy across the table the way a hand comes down on a desk. He didn't raise it. He never needed to. "Don't bother your grandfather with football. He needs his rest. The grin on Connor's face didn't disappear all at once. It faded like a light being dimmed slowly by someone who knew exactly how far to turn the dial. Diana nodded without looking at her son. "He's right, honey. Let Grandpa eat in peace." I opened my mouth. I had things to say that I wasn't tired, that I'd driven myself to a cardiologist appointment that morning, with no help from anyone, that I had watched every one of Connor's games since the boy was 9 years old, and I wasn't about to stop now. I had all of it ready. Instead, I picked up my fork and turned back to my plate. That was my mistake. Not the cornbread. Not walking over here. The mistake was the fork, the small daily surrender that I had been making for so long. It no longer felt like a choice. It felt like gravity. After dinner, I wrapped the cornbread in foil and carried it back to the guest house alone. The evening air was thick and warm the way Houston always is in September, carrying the faint smell of cut grass from the neighbor's yard. The main house glowed behind me, every light on music drifting faintly through the glass. Richard's voice rising and falling as he took another call. I set the dish on my kitchen counter and put my hand on the back of the chair across from mine. Maggie's chair. I did it without thinking, the same way I'd been doing it every morning for 6 years, my palm flat against the wood, like I was steadying something that wasn't there anymore. I stood there for a moment in the quiet of my small kitchen, the cornbread cooling on the counter, and I thought about the look on Connor's face when Richard cut him off. That slow dimming, I recognized it. I'd been watching the same light go out in myself for years. I just hadn't decided yet what to do about it. 3 days later, Richard knocked on my door for the first time in 8 months. I knew it was him before I opened it. His knock was different from Diana's 2 sharp, evenly spaced raps, the knock of a man who considered his time more valuable than yours and wanted you to understand that before he'd even said hello. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the crossword from the Houston Chronicle, and when I heard it, I folded the paper, set it down, and took one slow breath before I stood up. He was holding a bottle of Napa Cabernet. The label said 2019. Even from the doorway, I could tell it cost somewhere north of $200, which told me exactly how much he needed from me before he'd opened his mouth. Nate Walter. He caught himself and smiled wide and practiced. For you. Top of the line. I took the bottle. He knew I didn't drink. My cardiologist had been clear about that since my bypass 4 years ago, and I had mentioned it at Christmas dinner in front of the whole family. Richard remembered. Richard remembered everything that was useful to him. This bottle wasn't a gift. It was a costume. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside and I watched his eyes do what they always did in my guest house. A quick, involuntary sweep of the room, cataloging, assessing. 1,200 square feet. Simple furniture. No artwork worth mentioning. His expression stayed neutral, but I'd spent 31 years reading the faces of men who thought they were hiding something. I set the wine on the counter and poured myself another cup of coffee. I didn't offer him any. He sat down at my kitchen table without being invited, crossed one leg over the other, and leaned back in the chair with the comfort of a man who believed every room he entered was already his. "Walter," he said, "I'm going to be straight with you because that's the kind of relationship I think we should have." I sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around my mug. "All right, I am sitting on the opportunity of a lifetime." He leaned forward, elbows on my table, and his voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted you to feel like you were being let in on a secret. Austin Pinnacle Tower. Mixed-use commercial and residential, 38 stories right in the heart of downtown Austin. Pre-sales are already flying off the shelf. This project is going to define the Austin skyline for the next 50 years. I've heard you mention it, I said. And then you know what kind of numbers we're talking about. He spread his hands open on the table, a gesture meant to suggest abundance. Walter, I hit a small regulatory snag. Permit timing. The city is slower than we projected, and I need to show liquidity to keep my primary lender from getting nervous. It's a bridge loan situation, short-term, completely secure. I watched him. There was a faint shine of perspiration along his temple that hadn't been there when he walked in. His right hand, which he'd flattened on my table, was now tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the wood index finger, middle finger, ring finger, repeat. A man burning through his remaining calm. How much? I asked. He's 800,000. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed fast enough to sound casual, slow enough to land. 6 months, Walter. I give you back 1.2 million. That's a 50% return. You cannot beat that in any market anywhere at your age. At your age. He'd slipped it in like a compliment. And the collateral, I said. The guest house. He said it like it was obvious. You own it free and clear. You're not using it as anything other than a place to sleep. All you do is put a small lien against it. I clear the permits, the project closes, you get your money back with 50% on top. 6 months, Walter. In and out, in and I looked at him across the table. I looked at the sweat on his temple, and the tapping fingers, and the $200 bottle of wine sitting on my counter that I would never open. I looked at the man my daughter had chosen to build her life with, and I thought about Maggie, who had seen something in Diana worth fighting for right up until the end. I wondered what Maggie would have made of this moment, her husband being asked to hand over his last piece of solid ground by a man whose hands wouldn't stop moving. Richard, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. I'm 73 years old. My money exists for 2 reasons, my medical bills and my peace of mind. A bridge loan on my home is neither of those things. The answer is no. The shift was immediate, not dramatic. Richard was too controlled for dramatic. But the smile dropped by precisely the degree that politeness no longer required it, and something cold and flat moved into his eyes like a shade being pulled down over a window. Unbelievable, he said quietly. He pushed back from the table and stood, and his voice tightened like a wire being wound too far. After everything we've done for you, you live on this property because we allow it. We could have sold this land years ago. I paid for this house, Richard, I said. You won't lift a finger for your own family. His jaw muscles flexed. You know what you are. You are a selfish old man who is going to die alone in a 1,200-square-foot box and leave nothing behind worth remembering. He picked up the wine bottle from my counter, and I thought for a moment he was taking it back with him. But instead, he set it down hard. Not quite a throw, but close enough that the ceramic dish beside it rattled and slid 2 inches across the surface. Maggie's cornbread dish. You'll regret this, he said. I promise you that. He walked out and pulled my front door shut behind him with enough force to send a small vibration through the floor. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the dish still rocking slightly, settling back into stillness. Then I looked at the wine bottle. Then I looked at the door. Richard Mercer had just walked out of my house, furious, threatening, and desperate. I had seen that combination before many times in many different men across many different tables. And what I knew, what 31 years had burned into me as surely as any lesson I'd ever learned, was this: a man who is merely angry will shout and leave. But a man who is panicking will come back, and he will bring something worse than a bottle of wine. I picked up the ceramic dish, carried it to the cabinet, and put it safely away. Then I sat back down, picked up my coffee, and started thinking. I've had chest pains before. After 31 years tracking financial criminals across 17 states, your body keeps its own ledger. Every case you couldn't close, every witness who disappeared, every night you drove home at midnight, knowing the man you were building a case against was sleeping just fine. It all goes somewhere. Mine went to my chest. So when the pain woke me at 3 a.m. that Friday, I knew what it was before I was fully conscious. Not a heart attack. Something slower and meaner, the familiar tightening behind my sternum that my cardiologist Dr. Brandt over at Methodist called stress-induced angina. Manageable, he'd told me at my last appointment. As long as I kept the stress manageable, I sat up in bed and pressed 2 fingers against my sternum and breathed. The pain was a 7, maybe. Bad enough to make me careful. Not bad enough to call 911 and have strangers come through my door at 3 a.m. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. Maggie had made me tape a list of emergency numbers to the refrigerator 15 years ago, family first, then doctors, then neighbors. I had kept the list updated every year since she died out of habit, the same way I still set 2 coffee cups out every morning before I remembered. I called Diana. It rang 4 times. 5. I was about to hang up when she answered, her voice thick with sleep, and something else, a sharpness underneath it, like irritation that had been waiting just beneath the surface. Dad. Not a question. A statement. What now? Honey, I'm not feeling right, I said. I kept my voice steady. I had learned a long time ago that if you sound scared, people stop listening to what you're actually saying. I've got chest pains. Not terrible, but I'd rather not sit here alone with it. Can you drive me to the ER just to be safe? A sound came through the phone that I will remember for the rest of my life. Not words, just a breath long and slow, the sound of someone doing the math on how much this was going to inconvenience them. Dad, seriously. Her voice was fully awake now, which told me the tiredness had been performance. It's 3 a.m. I have the gala planning committee coming at 8, the whole committee, they're coming here. I cannot do this right now. If it's actually bad, call 911. Don't overthink it. The line went dead. I held the phone in my hand and looked at it for a moment. Then I set it down on the nightstand and sat there in the dark of my bedroom, my hand still pressed to my chest, the pain moving in slow pulses behind my ribs. She hadn't asked how bad it was. She hadn't asked if I was scared. She had calculated the cost of helping me and decided it didn't balance. I opened the Uber app. The driver was a young man named Marcus, who had a Houston Rockets air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror and gospel music playing low on the radio. He glanced at me once in the mirror when I got in, registered, the way I was holding myself, one hand flat against my chest, and he turned the music down without being asked. "You doing all right back there, sir?" "I've been better," I said. "Methodist Hospital, please." "Yes, sir. We'll get you there." He drove carefully, which I appreciated. No unnecessary accelerations, no hard braking. I watched Houston move past the window, the empty freeway, the downtown lights reflected in the bayou, the neighborhoods sleeping behind their hedges and iron gates. I had lived in this city for 38 years. Maggie and I had raised Diana here. I had worked cases out of the Houston field office for the last decade of my career. And tonight, I was riding to the emergency room in the back of a stranger's Toyota at 3 a.m. alone. The ER at Methodist was quiet. A nurse named Patricia got me into a bay within 20 minutes, hooked me to a monitor, checked my vitals with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. The nitroglycerin tablet dissolved under my tongue, and the pain began to ease within minutes, spreading outward and thinning like fog burning off. Stress-induced angina. The attending confirmed around 5 a.m. "Your heart looks fine, Mr. Kane, but your body is telling you something." Whatever's going on in your life right now, you need to get ahead of it. They kept me for observation until 9. I called another Uber. As we turned onto the street toward River Oaks, I saw Diana's white Range Rover through the window. It was not parked in the driveway of the main house. It was parked in front of the River Oaks Day Spa on Westheimer, sandwiched between a Mercedes and a Lexus, perfectly straight. Her gala committee. The whole committee coming at 8. I looked at the car until we turned the corner, and it disappeared. Then I turned back to the window and watched the familiar neighborhood slide past, and something in my chest that had nothing to do with angina pulled tight and stayed there. The attending had told me to get ahead of whatever was going on. Back in my guest house, I sat down at my kitchen table with a glass of water, and for the first time I let myself think clearly about Richard Mercer. Not with the patience I had been practicing for years. With the part of me that had once been paid to look at a situation and see it exactly as it was. A panicking man had come to my door 3 days ago. Now I was coming home from the emergency room alone. These were not separate events. I opened the drawer beneath the kitchen counter and pulled out a plain manila folder. Inside were 3 months of notes I hadn't let myself look at directly. Not yet. Until now, I had been telling myself I was being careful, measured, fair. I understood sitting there in my quiet kitchen that I had simply been afraid of what I already knew. The delivery man arrived at 8:15 on Monday morning. I heard the knock from the kitchen where I was finishing my second cup of coffee and listening to the weather report on the radio. The knock was professional, 3 quick raps evenly spaced the knock of someone paid to deliver things people didn't want to receive. I already knew before I crossed the living room and opened the door that whatever was in his hand was not good news. He was young in a gray uniform with a company logo on the chest, holding a digital scanner and a white envelope thick enough to mean serious intent. "Nathaniel Walter Kane," he asked. "That's me. Legal Express Delivery. Sign here, please." I signed the screen with my finger. He handed me the envelope and walked back to his van before I'd closed the door. I carried it to my desk. On the corner of the desk sat the letter opener Maggie had given me for our 30th anniversary, sterling silver, with our initials engraved on the handle. I picked it up and slid it beneath the flap and opened the envelope the same way I had opened every important document in my adult life, slowly, without rushing, because the contents wouldn't change regardless of how fast I got to them. I pulled out the papers and read the heading. "In the matter of the guardianship and estate of Nathaniel Walter Kane. Petition for appointment of guardian of the person and estate. Harris County District Court, State of Texas." The petitioners were listed on line 3. Richard Allen Mercer and Diana Lynn Kane Mercer. I read the document through once start to finish without stopping. Then I set it down on the desk and picked up the attached psychological evaluation authored by one Dr. Frank Odom, Ph.D., Clinical Psychology. According to Dr. Odom's 12-page report, I exhibited significant cognitive deterioration, an inability to manage financial decisions, and paranoid ideation, specifically an irrational distrust of family members attempting to act in my best interest. He recommended immediate appointment of a legal guardian with full authority over my financial and medical affairs. I read the name again. Frank Odom. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath. Frank Odom. I had spent 31 years memorizing names, witnesses, defendants, associates, shell company officers, accountants with gambling debts, and lawyers with second families. Frank Odom was not a name I had ever encountered, which meant either he was exactly what he claimed to be, or he was someone Richard had found in a place I hadn't looked yet. I set the papers down. Then I sat back in my chair and let my eyes move to the framed photograph on the corner of the desk. Diana, age 9, in the back seat of my old Buick, eyes red from crying, her Houston Astros cap pushed crooked on her head. I had taken that picture on a Tuesday afternoon in October, driving in circles through the Heights neighborhood because she hadn't wanted to go home yet. A boy named Derek had told the whole 4th grade that her drawings were ugly. She had held it together at school, held it together on the bus, and then the second she got in my car, she came apart completely, shoulders shaking, tears running down her face, the kind of crying that has no sound, because it's too deep for sound. I had driven for 40 minutes without saying anything, just letting her cry herself out. And when the crying finally slowed, I had looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, "You know what we do when someone tries to make us small die." She had wiped her face with her sleeve and looked back at me. "What? We outlast them." She had thought about that for a long moment. Then she had nodded very seriously, the way 9-year-olds nod when they decide to believe something. I looked at the conservatorship petition sitting on my desk. Then I stood up, picked it up, and walked across the lawn to the main house. They were by the pool, exactly where I expected them to be. Diana was stretched out on a chaise lounge in a white cover-up, oversized sunglasses, on a magazine open across her stomach. Richard was at the outdoor bar pouring something amber over ice. The sky was sharp blue above them, and the water was still, and they looked like an advertisement for a life that belonged to someone else. Diana heard the glass door and sat up, pulling her sunglasses down. The moment she saw the papers in my hand, her body went very still. Not surprised, still prepared, still. The stillness of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is now watching it arrive. "Dad." Her voice was careful, measured. What is this?" I held up the envelope. Richard set his glass down and crossed his arms, positioning himself the way men do when they want to appear reasonable while being anything but. His face arranged itself into an expression of practiced concern. Eyebrows slightly drawn, mouth soft, the look of a man playing someone who cared. "Walter," he said, "we were going to talk to you before the hearing. We didn't want you to find out this way." "What is this, Richard?" He took a step forward and lowered his voice, as though speaking quietly made what he was saying more true. "After the hospital incident last week, Diana and we talked. We're worried about you. You're confused sometimes. You forget things. What happened last week that scared us? You could have called us immediately, Walter, but instead you went alone. That's not sound judgment." My jaw tightened. I called Diana. She hung up. Diana looked away from me toward the pool, her fingers curling around the edge of the chaise lounge. She said nothing, but she didn't argue either, and that silence said everything it needed to. "The point is," Richard continued, his voice taking on a smooth, inexorable quality, like water finding its way through cracks, "you need someone to look after your affairs, your finances, your medical decisions, before something happens that can't be undone. We're doing this because we love you." I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were still fixed on the pool, on the blue surface of the water, going nowhere. "Diana." My voice came out quieter than I intended. "This paper says your father is incompetent. Is that what you believe?" She turned her head and looked at me then, and what I saw in her face was not guilt and not defiance. It was something worse than both a decision already made, settled and done, living behind her eyes like furniture that had been there so long she'd stopped seeing it. "It's what's best, Dad," she said. "We love you." Richard raised his cocktail glass in a small, contemptuous gesture. "See you in court, Walter. And honestly, I really don't think you can afford a real lawyer." I looked at him for one long moment. Then I turned and walked back across the lawn toward my guest house without hurrying. Behind me, I could hear the ice clicking in Richard's glass as he lifted it to his mouth. They thought they were watching a man retreat. They thought they were watching the end of something. Walking back across that lawn, I understood something I had been circling for weeks without admitting it. The only reason any of this had been allowed to go on as long as it had was because I had permitted it. My guest house door closed behind me. I stood in the quiet and looked at the back of my closet. Behind the rack of old suits I hadn't worn in years, behind the weight of everything I had put away, was a door I had not opened in 6 years. I walked toward it. They thought they knew that guest house. Diana had walked through it maybe 5 times in 8 years, always briefly, always with the particular impatience of someone visiting a place they considered beneath their attention. Richard had never made it past the living room. Neither of them had ever noticed the back of my closet because neither of them had ever looked. When you decide someone is invisible, you stop seeing the details of their life. That was their first mistake. It was also their last. The closet was narrow, 6 feet wide, lined on both sides with shirts and slacks I wore for errands, and at the back, a rack of suits I hadn't touched in years. A charcoal Hickey Freeman I'd worn to congressional testimony in 2009. A Navy Brooks Brothers from the year Maggie and I attended the IRS Commissioner's Dinner in Washington. They smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I pushed the rack aside on its rail, the hangers scraping softly, and pressed my palm flat against the reader-mounted flush to the back wall. The biometric scanner read my palm print in 2 seconds. A green light blinked once. A deadbolt, the thickness of my wrist slid back with a sound like a bank vault, quiet and absolute, and the door swung inward. I stepped inside and pulled the cord on the overhead light. 3 monitors. 2 server towers humming with the low, steady breath of machines that had been running continuously for years. A wall of locked file cabinets, gray steel, each one labeled in my handwriting with a case number and a year. A dedicated satellite phone system mounted to the desk, encrypted, routed through a relay I had maintained since I left the agency. The air in here was cool and still held at 68 degrees by a separate climate unit I'd had installed when I built the room. No windows, no distractions. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it all. I had built this room in the 2nd year after Maggie died, when I realized that the silence of the guest house was going to either consume me or become useful. I had chosen useful. I had never told Diana it existed. I had never told anyone. I sat down at the console and looked at the photograph I kept taped to the bottom edge of the center monitor, Maggie in 1987 standing in front of our first Houston house on Roxton Road, squinting into the afternoon sun, laughing at something I'd said that I couldn't remember anymore. Her hand was shading her eyes. She looked like she owned the whole street. "I know Maggie," I said quietly to the photograph. I let it go too long. I picked up the satellite phone. The number I dialed was one I had not used in 6 years, but it lived in my memory the way the important things do, without effort, without searching. It rang twice. "Webb Legal, Caroline Webb speaking." "Caroline," I said, "it's Walter Kane." The pause that followed was exactly 3 seconds long. I counted. "Mr. Kane." Her voice shifted not unprofessionally, but unmistakably. The practiced steadiness of a courtroom attorney suddenly containing something more personal underneath it. "My God. Dad talks about you. He talks about you all the time. He always wondered what happened after you retired. How is your father? Stubborn, healthy, still mad he didn't catch the Kellerman case before you did?" A brief warmth in her voice, and then it sharpened back to steel. "What's happened? I've been served with a conservatorship petition," I said. "Harris County. My son-in-law and my daughter are the petitioners. They've attached a psychological evaluation from a man named Frank Odom. Who is Frank Odom? That's what I need you to find out. When did you receive it? This morning. Hearing date. I flipped to the last page of the petition. 3 weeks. Another pause shorter this time. The pause of someone already thinking 3 moves ahead. All right. I need to tell you something before we go further, Mr. Kane. Taking this case means I'm going up against whoever Richard Mercer hired in a Houston courtroom on 3 weeks' notice. I want to be clear that I understand that. I know what I'm asking. Good. Her voice was all business now, clean and certain, the voice I remembered from the one time I had watched her argue a motion in Dallas federal court. 2 years after she passed the bar, her father had invited me, proud enough to burst. She had taken apart opposing counsel's expert witness in 11 minutes. Then I'll be in Houston tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. And Mr. Kane, before I hang up, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. This Frank Odom. You've never met him. Never had any contact with him, medical, professional, social, never heard the name in my life. The sound she made was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone who has just spotted something in the distance and recognized it for what it was. Interesting, she said. I'll see you tomorrow. Now I turned to the monitors and opened the first of 3 windows I would need. I had been a consultant to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division for 4 years after my retirement, reviewing case structures, advising on complex financial fraud patterns. My access credentials had technically lapsed 18 months ago, but certain back-channel databases, the ones built in the 1990s and never properly decommissioned, still recognized my login. Not because anyone had forgotten to close the door. Because in federal systems, doors like that don't close unless someone specifically orders them shut, and nobody had ever thought to order it. I was not going to hack anything. I was not going to access anything I wasn't entitled to access. I was simply going to look at what was already in front of me. I typed the name, Frank Odom, Texas. And I waited while the system found him. The results populated in under 4 seconds. I leaned forward, and the screen threw cold blue light across my face. And for the first time since Richard had walked through my door with that bottle of wine, I felt something clarify inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, but the particular stillness that comes when the numbers begin to resolve into a shape you recognize. Frank Odom was not a psychologist. He was not a psychiatrist. He was not a neurologist, and he was not a general practitioner. He had been a physical therapist, past tense. I kept reading. Caroline Webb arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. No flashy car, a rented Chevy Malibu gray, the kind of car that disappears in a parking lot. No designer bag, a single charcoal laptop case worn across one shoulder, the leather scuffed at the corners from use. She was wearing dark slacks and a white button-down with the sleeves already rolled to her forearms, and her hair was pulled straight back with the no-nonsense severity of someone who had decided years ago that appearance was a tool, not a performance. She shook my hand at the door with a grip that meant business, stepped inside, and scanned the living room once with the quick, cataloging eyes I recognized from her father. "You look well, Mr. Kane," she said. "Walter," I said. "Your father calls me Walter." "Walter." She nodded, accepting it. Then her eyes found the door at the back of the closet which I had left open. She looked at the server towers and the monitors and the wall of file cabinets, and she stood there for a moment, taking it in, and then she turned back to me with an expression that was not surprise but something adjacent to respect. They really have no idea who they're dealing with, do they?" she said. It wasn't a question. Not yet. I gestured to the chair I'd set up at the corner of the desk. "Sit down." I'll show you what I found last night. She sat, opened her laptop, and connected to her firm's secure server in under 30 seconds. I slid the conservatorship petition across the desk with Frank Odom's evaluation on top. She picked it up, scanned it with the speed of someone accustomed to reading dense legal documents quickly, and stopped at the signature block. Her jaw tightened just slightly, just once, and then her face went smooth again. Frank Odom, Ph.D., Clinical Psychology. She read aloud. Give me 2 hours. Take 1, I said. She almost smiled. I'll take 54 minutes. She was exactly right. 54 minutes later, she looked up from her screen with the particular expression of someone who has found something so obvious it borders on insulting. All right, she said. Frank Odom. Where do you want me to start? The beginning. The beginning is, this Frank Odom is not a psychologist. He's not a psychiatrist, not a neurologist, not a clinical anything. She turned the laptop so I could see the screen. He was a licensed physical therapist in the state of Texas. Past tense. The Texas State Board of Physical Therapy Examiners permanently revoked his license in 2017. I leaned forward. On what grounds? Take your pick. She ticked them off with the flat efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. Medicare billing fraud. He was submitting claims for treatment sessions that never happened, sometimes billing for patients he'd never met. And then there's the second count. She paused. He was running a prescription referral scheme out of his clinic in Katy. Opioids. He had arrangements with 2 physicians who would write scripts on his recommendation, no questions asked, and Odom collected a fee per prescription. The DA called it a pill mill with a physical therapy front. The room was quiet for a moment, except for the hum of the servers. Federal charges, I asked. He did 12 counts. He went to trial and took a plea on 8 served 14 months in a federal corrections facility in Beaumont, released 2019. He's been in something of a gray zone since then. Occasional consulting work, nothing licensed. She closed that window and opened another. But here's where it gets interesting, Walter. A man like Odom, no license, federal conviction, no legitimate income. He's expensive to find if you need him. You don't find someone like that through a Google search. You find him through a connection. On what kind of connection? A financial one. She turned the laptop back toward herself and typed for a moment, pulling up a document that looked like a court filing. When Odom was arrested in 2017, his bail was set at $150,000. He didn't have it. A bondsman covered the note, but the bondsman required a corporate guarantor, a co-signer with assets sufficient to cover the bond in case Odom ran. My hands went very still on the surface of the desk. Chuku. Who was the guarantor? I asked, though the answer had already begun assembling itself in my mind, the way answers do when you've spent enough years doing this work. Caroline looked at me steadily. A Texas LLC called Mercer Property Holdings, registered in Houston. The managing member is listed as Richard Allen Mercer. I sat back in my chair. 7 years. Richard had guaranteed Frank Odom's bail 7 years ago, before Austin Pinnacle Tower, before the loan request, before any of this. He had found a broken man with a federal conviction and a desperate need for money, and he had paid to keep that man available. Not for any immediate purpose, as inventory. The way a chess player keeps a piece off the board until the board requires it. He didn't find Odom last week, I said. No, Caroline said. He's owned him for 7 years. Paid the bail, almost certainly paid his defense costs, probably kept him on a quiet retainer. She closed the laptop halfway, her eyes steady on mine. Walter, this wasn't an impulsive reaction to you refusing the loan. He had this ready. The petition, the evaluator, all of it was prepared in advance. The loan request was a test. When you failed his test, he activated what he already had waiting. The word premeditated moved through my mind like cold water. "There's one more thing," Caroline said. She reopened the laptop. "I found something in the bail filing that doesn't fit. Odom's clinic was in Katy, that's 40 minutes from River Oaks. Richard Mercer runs commercial real estate. There's no natural connection between these two men." So I pulled Mercer Development Group's filing history. She looked up at me. "Walter, I can't tell yet where Richard found the money to come after you. His company financials look like they're held together with tape and goodwill. But there's a thread here I haven't pulled all the way yet." "No, pull it," I said. She nodded and reached for her coffee. "I need another hour." I turned back to my monitors and opened the window I had been building since the previous night, the financial architecture of Mercer Development Group, layer by layer, shell company by shell company. Caroline was pulling the legal thread. I was pulling the financial one. And somewhere in the middle, I was beginning to understand, was where this whole thing was actually held together. I typed in the next search string and watched the results populate, and the shape emerging from the data was not what I had expected. It was worse. I have spent 31 years reading financial statements, the way other men read maps, not for what they show you, but for the shape of what they're hiding. A healthy company's financials have a rhythm to them. Revenue flows in at predictable intervals, expenses go out in patterns that match the stated business model, and the numbers tell a story that holds together from one quarter to the next. When that rhythm breaks, when the expenses are wrong, or the revenue timing doesn't match the claimed deal flow, or the cash reserves drop faster than any legitimate business activity can explain, you feel it before you can name it. Like a musician hearing a wrong note in a piece they've played 1,000 times. Mercer Development Group's financials had been screaming at me for 40 minutes. I had started with the public records, Secretary of State filings, Harris County property records, UCC financing statements. All publicly accessible, all legal, all telling a story Richard had clearly assumed nobody would bother to read. From there, I moved to the server logs I could access through my old IRS back channel. Not the content of his emails, not his private communications, but the metadata. File transfer records, data room activity. The digital footprint that every desperate man leaves behind when he's moving too fast to be careful. Austin Pinnacle Tower was not a 9-figure opportunity. It was a 9-figure catastrophe. "Caroline," I said. She looked up from her own screen across the desk. "Talk to me. The Austin project." He told me it was a regulatory snag permit timing. I turned my monitor so she could see the data. It's not a snag. The project is $75 million over its original construction budget. He ran out of capital halfway through the structural phase. He falsified his liquidity reports to keep his primary lender from pulling out submitted financials showing reserves he didn't have. I scrolled down. He has 22 active contractor liens filed against the project in Travis County. 22. The concrete subcontractor alone is owed $400,000. Caroline's jaw tightened. Who is the primary lender? A private equity fund called Apex Ridge Capital, Dallas-based. I pulled up the fund profile. These aren't bankers. They specialize in distressed commercial projects. They come in when every conventional lender has already walked away. Their standard contract includes a cross-collateralization clause, which means if the borrower defaults, they don't just seize the project. They seize every asset connected to the borrower's corporate structure. His house, Caroline said flatly. His house, his vehicles, his LLC portfolio. Everything Mercer Development Group touches. I opened the next document. And 10 days ago, Apex Ridge sent him a capital call. How much? $8 million. due in 7 business days from the date of the letter. I looked at her. The letter was dated the day after I refused his loan request. Caroline set her pen down on the desk. She pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and I could see her assembling the same structure I had been building, the pieces clicking into place with the cold, mechanical logic of a case that was starting to explain itself. "He didn't need $800,000 as a bridge loan," she said slowly. "No. He needed it as a good faith payment to buy himself 1 more week with Apex Ridge." When I said no, he had nothing left to offer them. I leaned back in my chair. So he activated Odom. He filed the petition. And he's betting that a court-ordered conservatorship will give him access to my assets fast enough to cover his capital call before Apex Ridge starts seizure proceedings. "He's not trying to rob you," Caroline said. "He's trying to sacrifice you to save himself." "That's exactly right." She picked her pen back up and began writing. "All right, who runs Apex Ridge Capital?" "A man named Thomas Briggs, based in Dallas." I pulled up his profile and looked at it for a long moment. Something moved in my chest, not quite recognition, not quite memory, but the edge of both. I know that name. Professionally. Possibly. I couldn't place it, yet it was there at the edge of clarity, the way a word sits on the tip of your tongue. "Let me sit with it, while you sit with it," Caroline said. "I want you to think about something." She turned her laptop toward me. On the screen was a spreadsheet she'd been building Mercer Development Group's known cash outflows for the past 60 days. "Richard is bankrupt. He can't pay Apex Ridge. He can't make payroll on the Austin project. He cannot, by any reasonable analysis, have had the liquid cash to retain a law firm, pay expert witness fees, and file this petition." She tapped the screen. "So, where did the money come from?" "Walter, in the last 60 days, what source of money did Richard Mercer have access to that wouldn't show up on his corporate balance sheet?" The question landed in the room and sat there. I looked at the spreadsheet. I looked at the dates. And then something moved through me, cold and slow, like water finding its way through rock. And I understood what Caroline was pointing at before she said it. She was pointing at something I hadn't let myself look at directly. Something that had a name I was not ready to say out loud yet. Something that had Maggie's name on it. "I need to make a phone call," I said. "Walter. Give me 5 minutes." I stood up and picked up the satellite phone and turned away from the monitors, because what I was about to check was going to require me to be alone with it for at least that long. I dialed the number for the private bank in Boston that managed the foundation's accounts. The account I had set up 11 years ago. The account I had named after my wife. The account I had trusted my daughter to manage because it had Maggie's name on it. And I believed that would mean something. The phone rang 3 times. A banker I hadn't spoken to in 4 years answered. "Mr. Kane," he said with the careful warmth of someone who rarely heard from the founder directly. "This is unexpected." "I'm invoking my founder's rights," I said. "I need a full transaction report for the Maggie Kane Foundation. Every disbursement and transfer for the past 12 months. Secure email, send it now." A pause. "Sir, that may take a few minutes to—" "Send it now," I said again, very quietly. He sent it in 3 minutes. I looked at the total asset balance first. It was supposed to be above $3.5 million. The number on the screen was 587,000. I felt something tighten behind my eyes, not quite pain, but the physical sensation of understanding arriving too fast. I began scrolling down through the line items, and Caroline must have heard something change in my breathing, because she looked up from her screen and watched me without speaking, and the room was very quiet except for the servers and the sound of everything I had trusted coming apart one line item at a time. There are things you know before you know them. The mind sees the shape of something terrible before it allows you to look at it directly. It gives you small warnings, a tension in the shoulders, a reluctance to open a particular drawer, a reason that materializes out of nowhere to delay the thing you already understand you need to do. I had been moving around the edges of this for weeks. I had built a folder. I had noted the IRS flag. I had watched the numbers on Richard's corporate filings with the professional detachment of a man reviewing someone else's problem. But I had not opened the Foundation's account. Not once. Not in 3 months of watching everything else. Because it had Maggie's name on it. I read the transaction report from the top. The Maggie Kane Foundation had been established with $3.8 million, the bulk of the proceeds from the sale of our Roxton Roadhouse after Maggie died, plus a portion of her life insurance. Its stated mission was to fund scholarships for high school students in the Houston Independent School District who couldn't afford college application fees, test prep, or their first semester's textbooks. Maggie had been a public school teacher for 30 years. She had paid for students' supplies out of her own pocket more times than I could count. The foundation was the closest thing to a monument I knew how to build. Diana was its managing director. I had never once audited her. The line items scrolled past my eyes in silence. Small, legitimate disbursements, $2,000 to a student testing organization, $5,000 to a college counseling nonprofit in the 5th Ward. Then the numbers changed. 8 months ago, $210,000. Payee listed as Mercer Development Group. Category Consulting Services rendered. 5 months ago, $130,000. Payee listed as Houston Premier Events, LLC. Category Gala Planning and Event Coordination Services. I stopped scrolling. I typed Houston Premier Events, LLC into my search window. Secretary of State filing registered 4 months ago. Registered agent address, a P.O. box in Stafford. Managing member Richard Allen Mercer. He had billed my wife's scholarship foundation for planning his own party. And the total $340,000 had gone from Maggie's foundation into Richard's accounts. Into the same accounts that were hemorrhaging cash on a collapsing tower in Austin. Into the same pool of money he had used to retain a law firm, pay Frank Odom, and file the petition that called me incompetent. They had stolen from Maggie's foundation to finance calling me insane. I clicked on the scanned images of the checks. The bank provided them automatically for all disbursements above $20,000. The check for $210,000 to Mercer Development Group was on the screen in front of me, clean and sharp, the signature line perfectly legible. Diana Lynn Kane Mercer. Her handwriting, her signature. The same signature I had watched her practice at the kitchen table of our Roxton Roadhouse when she was 16 years old, the day I took her to open her first bank account. I had held her hand over the paper and guided the pen and told her a signature is a promise. It means you stand behind every word. I closed the laptop. Not quickly, deliberately, the way you close a door on something you need to contain. I stood up and walked to the small door at the back of the office that opened onto the side yard, and I pushed it open and stepped outside into the Houston night. The air was thick and warm, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant rain, and above the rooftops, the sky was the particular orange-gray of a city that never goes fully dark. I stood there for a long time. I had prepared myself for Richard's corruption, the way you prepare for weather you've seen forecasted for days. You know it's coming, you make arrangements, you don't let yourself be surprised. I had, even in the honest part of myself, prepared for the possibility that Diana had been weak. That Richard had manipulated her, pressured her, used her trusting nature against her. I had held that possibility in reserve as a mercy I might need to extend. But Diana's signature on that check was not the handwriting of a woman being manipulated. It was deliberate, practiced, completely steady. She had signed it the way you sign things you have decided to sign, without hesitation, without the tremor that comes when your hand knows something your mind is trying to ignore. My eyes burned. Not from the night air. I had lost Maggie 6 years ago. That grief was a country I had learned to live in. I knew its roads, its seasons, its particular quality of silence on Sunday mornings. But what I felt standing in that side yard looking at the orange Houston sky was a different kind of loss. The loss of Diana. Not to death. To a choice she had made with clear eyes and a steady hand, and had been making apparently for months. I stood there until the tightness in my chest eased enough to breathe around. Then I wiped my face with the back of my hand and went back inside. Caroline was watching me from across the desk. She didn't say anything. She had the good sense to wait. $340,000, I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. From Maggie's foundation, Diana's signature on both checks, Richard's companies as the payees. Caroline pressed her lips together. Walter, I'm sorry. And don't be sorry yet. I sat back down at the console. The grief was still there, it wasn't going anywhere, but underneath it, something else had settled into place, cold and certain and very clear. I need you to listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. We are no longer defending against this petition. We are going to dismantle everything Richard Mercer has built, piece by piece, and we are going to do it in that courtroom in front of a judge, so that there is no version of events in which either of them walks away from what they've done. Caroline looked at me for a long moment. Then she opened a fresh document on her laptop and said, "Tell me what you need." First, I said, "I need to know everything you can find about Apex Ridge Capital and a man named Thomas Briggs." I picked up the satellite phone, because I think I finally remembered where I know that name from. 35 years ago, I sat across a metal table from Thomas Briggs in a windowless interview room in the Dallas field office and told him the truth about his own case. He was 30 years old then. Brash, loud, the kind of young man who filled every room he walked into with the noise of his own confidence. He had built a small commercial real estate fund from scratch. Briggs Capital Partners, 12 investors, $22 million under management, and he had done it through sheer aggression and a willingness to work hours that would have broken most people. He was also, according to the SEC referral that had landed on my desk 6 weeks earlier, about to be indicted for conspiracy to commit securities fraud in connection with the Hargrove Industries collapse. The SEC was convinced he was part of it. The numbers at first reading pointed directly at him. $3 million had moved through an account with his name on it in the weeks before Hargrove imploded. The timing was damning. The paper trail was clean in the way that paper trails are clean when someone has been careful to make them look that way. I spent 3 nights with those records, and on the 3rd night at 2 a.m, I found what nobody else had found, a series of time-stamped wire transfers that proved the $3 million had moved through Briggs's account without his knowledge or authorization. Someone had used his credentials. Someone had set him up specifically because his name on the paper would draw attention away from the actual architects of the fraud. He was not a criminal. He was a frame. I testified to that effect. The SEC withdrew. The indictment was never filed. Tom Briggs went on to build Apex Ridge Capital into one of the largest private equity funds in the Southwest. He called me once 4 years after Maggie died. His voice was quiet in a way I had never heard from him before, careful with something he wanted to say correctly. "Hammer," he'd said, "I know what you did for me, not just the testimony, the 3 nights. If you ever need anything in this life, anything at all, you call this number." I had never called. Until tonight. I dialed from the satellite phone. An assistant answered on the second ring. Efficient guarded the particular wariness of someone paid to protect access to a very busy man. Apex Ridge Capital, Mr. Briggs's office. My name is Walter Kane, I said. Tell him the hammer is on the line. Tell him it's about Hargrove. Silence for 4 seconds. Then, one moment, Mr. Kane. I was on hold for less than 30 seconds. Walter. Tom's voice came through the line with the warmth of a man who has been waiting for a call he wasn't sure would ever come. He sounded older, the edges of his voice had softened, but underneath it was the same core I remembered. Solid. Certain. My God. I was starting to think you'd gone off the grid permanently. I thought about it, I said. Tom, I don't have time to ease into this. I need to talk to you about a loan in your portfolio. A borrower named Richard Mercer, Austin Pinnacle Tower. A pause, brief, professional. You know him. He's my son-in-law, and he's in the process of filing a fraudulent conservatorship petition against me using your capital call as the financial pressure point that made it necessary. I kept my voice flat and factual, the way I had learned to deliver information that mattered. I've reviewed your loan file metadata, Tom. 75 million over budget. 22 contractor liens. Falsified liquidity reports on the original application. You're not going to recover from that project. Tom was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had shifted. The warmth was still there. But behind it now was the calculating intelligence that had rebuilt his career from nothing. What do you need, Walter? I need to buy the debt, I said. All of it. The note, the default position, the collateral rights, the cross-collateralization clause, everything Apex Ridge holds against Richard Mercer and Mercer Development Group. I want to be his sole creditor. Walter, that paper is worth less than... I'm not buying it as an investment. I'm buying it as a remedy. I paused. I'll wire the full outstanding principal $8 million from a blind trust within the hour. Clean transfer, no conditions, no negotiation on price. I just need it done tonight. The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. I counted them. You saved my life, Hammer, Tom said finally. His voice had gone quiet in the same way it had gone quiet on that phone call 4 years ago, careful with the weight of what he was saying. Not figuratively. If you hadn't found those wire transfers, I would have gone to federal prison for something I didn't do. My fund would have been dissolved. Everything I built after that Apex Ridge, everything, none of it exists without those 3 nights you spent in that records room. Tom, I'm not finished. He cleared his throat. The answer is yes. I'll have my legal team execute the transfer agreement tonight. Standard note purchase. Apex Ridge assigns all rights and interests in the Mercer loan to a designated trust entity of your choosing. Done before midnight. A brief pause. Walter, whatever you're about to do to that man, do it right. I intend to, I said. Good hunting, Hammer. I hung up and turned to Caroline, who had been watching me from across the desk, with her pen hovering above her notepad, and an expression on her face that told me she had pieced together enough of my side of the conversation to understand what had just happened. You bought his debt, she said. It was not quite a question. As of midnight tonight, Richard Mercer's $8 million loan to Apex Ridge Capital will belong to me, I said. I will be his sole creditor. He will be in default to me. I looked at her steadily. Draft an emergency notice of foreclosure and seizure. Everything covered by the cross-collateralization clause, the River Oaks property, his vehicles, his LLC holdings, all of it. Caroline's pen was already moving. When do you want to serve it? I said. We don't serve him. We don't warn him. We don't give him a single hour to prepare. I looked at the conservatorship petition still sitting at the corner of the desk. He's expecting a fight over my sanity. He has no idea his entire life is on the table. I picked up the petition and set it back down. We walk into that courtroom and we hand it to him. In front of the judge, in front of everyone. Caroline looked up from her notepad. For the first time since she had walked through my door that morning, something that was almost a smile crossed her face, sharp and brief like a blade catching light. "That," she said, "is why they called you the Hammer." She went back to drafting. I turned back to my monitors. The transfer would take until midnight to finalize, which meant I had time for one more thread. One I had been putting off since I first saw Diana's email address in the Mercer Group server logs, a shared access folder I was legally entitled to review as the Foundation's founder, and which I had been avoiding for the same reason I had avoided the Foundation's bank records, because I already suspected what was in it, and I had wanted to be wrong. I typed in the access credentials and opened the folder. The most recent file was a thread of internal emails between Diana and Richard dated 8 months ago. I clicked on the first message and started reading, and the shape of everything I thought I had understood rearranged itself completely. I almost didn't open the email thread. I had the debt transfer processing. I had Caroline drafting the foreclosure notice. I had Frank Odom's revoked license and Richard's falsified financials and $340,000 of stolen scholarship money and Diana's signature on 2 checks. I had enough. Any competent attorney would tell me I had more than enough, but I had spent 31 years knowing that enough is what guilty men count on. They count on you stopping when the case looks complete. They count on the reasonable assumption that once you have what you need, you stop looking for what you don't. The cases I had closed the ones that actually held, that couldn't be appealed or argued down or picked apart on a technicality, were the ones where I had kept reading past the point where any reasonable man would have stopped. So I kept reading. The email folder was a shared drive, the Foundation's administrative server, which both Diana and Richard had been granted access to 3 years ago when Diana took on a more active management role. As the Foundation's founder, my access credentials superseded theirs. Every document, every communication run through that server was legally accessible to me. I clicked on the oldest unread thread. It was dated January 14th, 8 months ago, a Tuesday morning. The sender was Diana Kane Mercer. The recipient was Richard Mercer. The subject line read, "Thinking Ahead." I read it once. Then I read it again, slowly making sure I was reading exactly what was there, and not what I feared might be there. "Rich, I've been thinking about the Austin situation, and I want to talk through something before you dismiss it. Dad is sitting on assets worth at least $4 million, probably more, if you count the land position correctly. The guest house, his retirement accounts, whatever's left in the Foundation principal. He's not spending any of it. He's not going anywhere. He's just sitting on it. If we move strategically while he's still manageable, we don't need the Austin deal to work out. We have a cushion. I think we should start looking at options." D. Richard's reply came 40 minutes later. "You sure about this? He's sharp, Di. Sharper than he looks." Diana's response was 3 sentences. "He's 73 and he's lonely, and he hasn't pushed back on anything in years. He thinks we tolerate him because we love him. Trust me." I set the phone down on the desk, while he's still manageable. I read the phrase a 3rd time, and then a 4th, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain I was not misreading it, not importing a meaning that wasn't there, not letting the pain of the evening distort what the words plainly said. But the words were plain. They did not require interpretation. Richard had not come to my door with a bottle of wine because he was desperate and out of options. He had come because Diana had told him to. Because they had been planning this together since January 8 months ago, before the Austin project fully collapsed, before the capital call, before any of it. The loan request had been a test, Diana's word, not mine, while he's still manageable. When I passed the test by refusing, they moved to the contingency they had already prepared. Richard was not the architect of this. Diana was. I stood up from the desk and walked to the small window at the far end of the office. Outside, the Houston night was quiet, the neighborhood sleeping the distant sound of a car on the feeder road, the orange glow of the city above the rooflines. I put one hand flat against the glass and looked at the reflection of the office behind me. The monitors glowing, the file cabinets standing in their rows, the photograph of Maggie taped to the bottom of the center screen. I thought about Diana at 9 years old crying in the back of my car. We outlast them, Di. And her solemn nod, deciding to believe it. I thought about Diana at 16, bending over the bank signature card, with her tongue pressed to her upper lip in concentration, making the letters of her name for the first time as an official document. A signature is a promise. I thought about Diana at 37, sitting across this same desk, in this same house 8 months ago, typing, he's 73, and he's lonely to her husband at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning. My throat tightened until breathing required conscious effort. I stood at the window and let it pass the way you let a wave pass, not by fighting it, but by holding still until it moves through you and recedes. Then I turned away from the window and went back to the desk. I checked my phone. There were 47 notifications. I hadn't looked at legal alerts, bank confirmations, a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. I scrolled past them and stopped. There was a text message from Connor. Sent 6 weeks ago at 11:34 on a Tuesday night in August. I had seen it arrive and marked it to read later, and then the week had gotten complicated, and I had not gone back to it. I opened it now. Grandpa, I don't really know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. I heard Mom and Dad talking late last night. Something about a doctor and papers and your house. I didn't understand all of it, but it didn't sound right. It sounded like they were talking about doing something to you. I'm probably wrong, and I don't want to make things weird, but I'm scared. Please be careful. Sue. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the cool surface and took a long, slow breath. Connor had heard them in August. He had been 17 years old, alone in his bedroom at 11:30 at night, scared enough to text his grandfather, but careful enough to soften it. I'm probably wrong the way a child softens a truth he hopes isn't true. He had sent this 6 weeks ago, and I had not read it. But I had opened that folder tonight. I had picked up that phone. Something had moved me toward both of those things on this particular night, at this particular hour, and I understood now what it was. Without knowing it, Connor had started all of this. His text in August was what had made me pull that folder from the drawer. His worry had been the thing that pushed me past the edge of what I was willing to ignore. He was 17 years old, and he was the only person in this family who had tried to protect me. I picked the phone back up and looked at his message one more time. Then I put it in my shirt pocket close to my chest and turned back to the monitors. Tomorrow I would talk to Connor. Tonight there was still work to do. I found him in the side yard behind the main house at 4:30 in the afternoon. He was alone. Which surprised me. Connor usually had teammates around him, the easy, loose cluster of 17-year-olds who moved through the world like they owned it and hadn't yet learned they didn't. But today he was by himself, working a worn leather football through a passing drill he'd clearly invented, dropping back 3 steps and throwing tight spirals at a target he'd rigged from a garbage can and a piece of rope tied to the oak tree at the property line. The throws were clean and hard. The ball made a satisfying crack against the makeshift target every time. He heard my footsteps on the grass and turned. His face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: surprise, then relief, then something more complicated that settled into a careful neutrality I recognized, because I had seen it on his face every Sunday at dinner when he was trying not to say the thing he was actually thinking. "Grandpa." He tucked the football under his arm. "I didn't know you were out here." "I was looking for you," I said. He glanced back at the main house reflexively, the habit of a boy who had learned to watch for windows and open doors. "Mom and Dad are out," he said. "Some meeting downtown. They won't be back until 7. "I know." I walked to the oak tree and stood in its shade. The September afternoon was still hot, the Houston sun low and flat, turning the grass the color of old copper. "I want to talk to you about something. Come sit down." He came and sat on the low concrete border of the garden bed, resting the football on his knee, and looked at me with Maggie's gray eyes, careful and open at the same time, waiting. I took my phone from my shirt pocket. I opened the text thread and held it out to him. He looked at the screen. A muscle in his jaw moved. He handed the phone back without speaking, his fingers tight around the football on his knee. "Connor," I said, "I need you to know that I read this. The night I received it, I marked it to read later, and then I forgot. I forgot for 6 weeks. I paused. "I am sorry about that." His head came up sharply. "You don't have to apologize to me." "I do," I said. "You reached out when you were scared, and I didn't respond. That matters." I put the phone back in my pocket. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. What exactly did you hear that night?" Connor turned the football slowly in his hands, end over end, the way young men handle objects when they're deciding how much truth to give you. Then he set it down on the concrete beside him and looked up. "It was August," he said. "A Thursday, late, like past midnight. I got up to get water and their bedroom door was open a little and I could hear them talking." He stopped. "Dad was on the phone with someone, I think. I couldn't hear the other person. But I heard Dad say something about a doctor who could sign papers, and I heard Mom say your name, and then she said something like, 'It needs to happen before he starts asking questions.' And Dad said he won't. He never does." The words landed quietly. I kept my face still. "I didn't know what it meant," Connor said. His voice was lower now, rougher around the edges. "I thought maybe I misheard. I told myself I misheard. But it kept bothering me, so I texted you and then you didn't answer, and I thought maybe I really was wrong, so I just—" He pressed his lips together. "I didn't do anything. I should have done something. You did exactly the right thing," I said. "You sent that message. You put it in front of me, and even though I was slow to read it, it was there when I needed it." I leaned forward slightly. "Connor, what you heard that night, you weren't wrong. What your mother and father were planning, they went ahead and did. I received the court papers 4 days ago." The blood left his face. Not dramatically, slowly, like a tide going out. His hands pressed flat against his thighs. "Are you going to lose the house?" he asked. His voice was barely above a murmur. "The guest house, I mean." "Are they going to take it?" "No," I said. "They are not." He looked at me. Whatever he saw in my face seemed to settle something in him, because the rigid set of his shoulders loosened slightly. "How do you know?" "Because I spent 31 years making sure people like your father couldn't take things that didn't belong to them," I said. and I'm not done yet." Connor stared at me for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression, a reassessment quiet and complete, the look of someone revising a picture they thought they understood. "They always talked about you like you were—" He stopped himself. "Like I was old," I said. He winced. "Yeah, I am old," I said. "That part's accurate." I looked at him steadily. "But old and finished are not the same thing. Your grandmother understood that. She used to say that a man who stops being useful is a man who decided to, not a man who ran out of time." Connor was quiet for a moment. A mockingbird started up in the oak tree above us, cycling through its borrowed songs, cardinal blue jay something I couldn't identify. The afternoon light was going gold at the edges. "Grandpa," his voice was rough. "She would have Mom, I mean. She would have been—" He stopped. His throat worked. "Grandma would have been really disappointed." The words hit somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. I put my hand on his shoulder, the broad, solid shoulder of a boy who was almost a man, who had been awake at midnight, worrying about his grandfather, and hadn't known who else to tell. "Yes," I said quietly. "She would have." He dropped his chin to his chest. His shoulders shook once, just once, and he pulled them back with the effort of someone who had decided not to fall apart in front of a person he respected. His hands were pressed flat against his thighs again, knuckles pale. I kept my hand on his shoulder and did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say. Maggie used to do this, put her hand on my shoulder in the bad moments, and simply stay there, her presence, the whole of the comfort. I had always thought it was something she did naturally without thinking. I understood now it was something she had decided to do. A choice repeated until it became instinct. After a while, Connor lifted his head and wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. I thought about the foreclosure notice sitting on Caroline's laptop, the email thread, the palm scanner on the wall of my office, the satellite phone, Tom Briggs saying good hunting at 11:15 on a Tuesday night. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally am." He nodded once slowly, the same solemn nod Diana had given me in the back seat of my car when she was 9 years old, deciding to believe something. The resemblance was so exact it ached. He picked up the football. I stood up from the garden border and straightened my shirt. "The game Friday," I said. "St. Thomas. I'll be there." Connor looked up at me, and for the first time all afternoon, the careful neutrality dropped off his face completely, and he just looked young, 17, and relieved, and trying not to show how much that meant to him. "Yeah," he said. "Front row," I said. "Save me a spot." Thursday morning I woke up at 5:15 without an alarm. I lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the house. The guest house was quiet in the particular way of a building that has held the same silence for years, not empty, but settled every creak and shift, familiar enough to be invisible. Outside, the first gray light was beginning at the edges of the curtains. A mockingbird was working through its pre-dawn repertoire in the oak tree, undisturbed and unhurried, indifferent to what the day was going to require of everyone else. I got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. The main house across the lawn was dark. I thought about Richard sleeping in there, or not sleeping perhaps, which was a more satisfying thought, and then I let it go because satisfaction is not the same as preparation. And I had things to do before 8 o'clock. I showered, shaved carefully with the straight razor Maggie had given me on our 40th anniversary, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment when I was done. The face looking back at me was 73 years old. There were lines around the eyes that hadn't been there when I first moved to Houston, and the hair had gone fully white sometime in the last decade. But the eyes themselves were the same gray and clear and completely awake. I went to the closet. The suits were at the back, behind the everyday clothes, still in their dry cleaning bags from the last time I'd worn them. I pushed the bags aside one by one. The charcoal Hickey Freeman, the navy Brooks Brothers, and at the far end of the rack, in a bag that had grown slightly yellow around the seams from age, the suit I was looking for. Dark blue, almost black. Single-breasted Savile Row, made by a tailor on Jermyn Street, whose name I could no longer remember, purchased in the spring of 2013 for a specific occasion. The last time I had worn it, I was sitting at a table in front of the Senate Finance Committee, answering questions about a case that had sent a sitting congressman's chief of staff to federal prison. I had been the lead investigator. The suit had been my armor. I lifted it off the rack, slid off the dry cleaning bag, held it up to the light. It had been 11 years. I put it on. It still fit. Not perfectly, the shoulders were perhaps a quarter-inch wider than my shoulders were now, but close enough that only a tailor would notice. I knotted my tie in the bathroom mirror, the same half-Windsor I had used for every important day of my professional life, and looked at the result. I did not look like a confused old man playing dress-up. I looked like the man I had been before I decided to become invisible. I looked like the Hammer. Caroline arrived at 7:30 in the same gray rental Malibu, wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying her worn leather case. She was out of the car and halfway up the path before she stopped and looked at me standing in the doorway. "There he is," she said quietly. Not as a greeting, as a statement of fact, the way you say something when you've been waiting to see it confirmed. "Let's go," I said. Harris County District Court was a rectangular tower of concrete and glass on San Jacinto Street, downtown, built in the 1970s with the particular civic confidence of an era that believed government buildings should announce themselves. We found parking in the structure 2 blocks over and walked, Caroline carrying her case, me carrying nothing, because everything I needed was either already in that courtroom or on its way there. The 7th floor hallway outside courtroom 7B smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax, and the accumulated anxiety of people who had been coming here for years to have the worst days of their lives adjudicated by strangers. Long fluorescent lights ran the length of the ceiling. Vinyl chairs lined the walls. A water fountain at the far end dripped with metronomic regularity. Richard and Diana were already there. They were standing with their attorney near the courtroom doors, a man I recognized from Caroline's research as Marcus Hale, a civil litigation attorney, who specialized in estate and probate disputes, mid-50s, silver hair, a suit that was expensive without being remarkable. He was flipping through a folder of documents with the studied calm of a man who believed this was going to be straightforward. Richard stood beside him with his arms crossed, jaw set, wearing a charcoal suit of his own, and the expression of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. Diana stood slightly apart from both of them. She was wearing a cream blazer, and her hair was done perfect as always, armor of a different kind. She was looking at her phone. She did not look up when we came off the elevator. Richard saw us first. He looked at me, at the suit, at my posture, at Caroline beside me, and his mouth pulled at the corner in something between a smirk and a dismissal, the expression of a man filing away information he considers irrelevant. Then Diana looked up from her phone. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across her face, too fast to name, and then it was gone, replaced by an expression I had seen before on people who had committed themselves to a course of action and were no longer permitting themselves to question it. She tilted her head and said loudly enough for the hallway to hear, with a light, almost pleasant inflection that made it worse, "Dad, you can't even afford a real lawyer." The words landed in the fluorescent-lit hallway and hung there. Marcus Hale didn't look up from his folder. Richard let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Down the hall, a court clerk pushing a cart of files kept walking without breaking stride. Caroline did not react. She adjusted the strap of her case on her shoulder and looked straight ahead at the courtroom doors. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman who had typed, "He's 73, and he's lonely on a Tuesday morning in January," and then gone about her day. I looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let her know I had heard her, not long enough to give her anything back. Then I turned toward the courtroom doors. The bailiff pushed them open from inside. The room beyond was small and beige and smelled of the same burnt coffee that haunted the hallway, and the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency just below audible. 6 rows of gallery benches, mostly empty. 2 counsel tables facing a raised bench. An American flag in the corner, slightly faded. I walked in first. At the far end of the room, the door to the judge's chambers was closed. It would open in 4 minutes, and behind it was the woman who was going to look up from her docket and see something that was going to change the temperature of this entire proceeding. I had known Judge Patricia Holloway for 22 years. She had not known until she looked up from that docket this morning that I would be sitting at the respondent's table. I sat down. Caroline set her case on the table and opened it without hurrying. From across the aisle, Marcus Hale arranged his documents in a neat stack and clicked his pen. Richard leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who was already writing his victory speech. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose. The door to the chambers opened. Before I walk you into that courtroom, before everything they built comes down in a single morning comment, ready and let me know you're still here. What happens next, they never saw coming. This story carries fictional elements woven in for educational purposes. If you'd prefer to step away before we go further, that door is open, and I understand. Judge Patricia Holloway entered from the side door at 8:59. She was 62 years old, trim and precise, with silver-streaked hair cut close to her head, and the bearing of a woman who had stopped being impressed by courtrooms sometime in her late 30s. She had served on the Harris County District Court bench for 14 years, and before that, she had spent 11 years as an assistant United States attorney working financial fraud cases out of the Southern District of Texas. I had known her since 2002 when we had worked parallel tracks on the same investigation, her building the criminal case, me building the financial reconstruction. We had never been friends exactly, but we had been the kind of colleagues who trusted each other's work, which in that profession was worth considerably more. She settled into her chair, adjusted her robe, and picked up the day's docket without looking up. The courtroom was quiet. Marcus Hale had his documents arranged in a neat stack. Richard sat with his ankles crossed, projecting a relaxation so deliberate it was almost loud. Diana was beside him, hands folded on the table, her eyes fixed on a point above the judge's bench. Holloway put on her reading glasses. She scanned the first item on the docket. Her lips moved slightly as she read. Then she looked up. She looked up to identify the respondent the way judges do as a matter of procedure, and her eyes found me at the respondent's table, and the pen in her right hand stopped moving. The courtroom was not a large room. The distance between the bench and the counsel tables was perhaps 20 feet. I watched the color leave her face from that distance, not a dramatic draining, but a slow, cellular withdrawal, the way light goes when a cloud moves across the sun. Her chin came up slightly. Her lips parted. The pen slipped from her fingers and struck the bench with a sharp crack that echoed off the beige walls, and the sound brought every head in the room around to look at her. She stared at me. I looked back at her steadily and gave her the smallest nod. "My God," she said. The microphone on the gooseneck stand caught it and sent it through the room, not loud, but perfectly clear. Is that really the hammer?" Every head turned toward me. Marcus Hale's hand froze over his documents. Richard's ankles uncrossed. Diana's eyes came down from the point above the bench and landed on my face with an expression of pure, uncomprehending blankness. Holloway caught herself. She straightened, retrieved the pen, and set her jaw in the way judges do when they have revealed more than they intended. She turned her attention to Marcus Hale with the controlled deliberateness of someone reasserting authority. "Counselor," she said, her voice level now but carrying an edge that had not been there before. "Are you aware of who your respondent is?" Hale stood smoothing his jacket. "He's a retired accountant, Your Honor. Nathaniel Walter Kane, age 73. Holloway let out a single breath through her nose. "No, Counselor." Her eyes moved briefly back to me and then returned to Hale. "That is Walter Kane, the Hammer. 22 years ago, he rebuilt the financial architecture of the Meridian energy fraud from a single corrupted server backup and put 9 people in federal prison on the strength of his testimony alone. I was the assistant U.S. attorney on that case." She looked at Hale with an expression that stopped just short of pity. "Good luck. You are going to need considerably more of it than you brought this morning." Marcus Hale sat back down. The studied confidence had not left his face entirely, but it had developed cracks the way plaster develops cracks small at first spreading. Richard leaned sideways and said something sharp and low into Hale's ear. Hale gave a single tight nod and stood again. "Your Honor, the petitioners call their primary witness, Dr. Frank Odom." A side door opened. Frank Odom came in. He was smaller than I had expected, a slight gray-faced man in a suit that had been pressed recently, but fit him poorly, the jacket pulling across the shoulders, the trousers an inch too long. He moved to the witness stand with the careful, diminished gait of a man who had been in rooms like this before, and had not enjoyed what happened to him in them. He was sworn in, he sat down, and he looked at his hands in his lap for a moment, before he looked up at Marcus Hale. Hale walked him through the evaluation methodically. Odom testified to his credentials carefully, vaguely, and then described his assessment of my cognitive state with the smooth delivery of a man reciting something he had memorized. Significant cognitive deterioration, inability to manage complex financial decisions, paranoid ideation directed at family members. His recommendation, immediate appointment of a legal guardian. He did not once look at me during his testimony. His eyes moved between Hale, his hands, and a spot on the wall to the left of the bench. The eyes of a man who knows something is coming and has decided to watch for it from the sides. "Thank you, Dr. Odom," Hale said, and sat down with the air of a man who believed the work was done. Caroline stood. She picked up a single sheet of paper from her side of the table and walked toward the witness stand with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, which in a courtroom means the opposite of that. She stopped 6 feet from Odom and looked at him pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Odom," she said. "Not doctor. We'll address that in a moment." Hale was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is—" "Sit down, Mr. Hale." Holloway's voice was flat and final. "The witness has been qualified by the petitioners. Cross-examination proceeds." Hale sat. Caroline turned back to Odom. "Mr. Odom, on what specific date did you conduct your evaluation of Walter Kane?" Odom's fingers tightened in his lap. "I conducted a thorough assessment using a date, Mr. Odom, month, day, year. The assessment was comprehensive in nature. I reviewed, at what location?" Caroline's voice was still pleasant, which made it worse. "Your office, his home, a clinical facility." Odom's mouth opened and closed. A thin film of perspiration appeared at his hairline. "You've never met Walter Kane," Caroline said. "Not once. Not in a clinical setting, not informally, not in passing." "Is that correct?" "I was provided with materials, Materials. She turned to the bench. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a declaration from Mr. Kane confirming that he has never had any contact with Frank Odom, and I'd like to ask the witness to confirm under oath that his evaluation was based not on any examination of the respondent, but on 3 photographs taken without Mr. Kane's knowledge in a grocery store parking lot in River Oaks, provided to him by the petitioner. The courtroom went very still. Holloway removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench with a small, precise click. She looked at Odom with the expression of a woman who had spent decades watching people lie under oath and had developed a detailed taxonomy of the experience. Mr. Odom, she said, you are under oath. Did you evaluate Walter Kane based on direct examination, or did you not? Odom's hands were shaking visibly, now trembling against his thighs. He looked at Hale, who gave him nothing. He looked at Richard, whose jaw was set so tight the muscles were visible from across the room. He looked at the judge, who was waiting with the infinite patience of someone who already knew the answer and was simply giving him the opportunity to say it himself. I was given photographs, he said finally, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and a written description of behaviors. I was told that a direct examination was not possible due to the respondents. You diagnosed a man you have never met. Holloway's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Based on photographs taken without his knowledge, Carolyn placed her single sheet of paper on the overhead projector. A bank transfer record appeared on the wall, sharp, legible, unmistakable. From Mercer Property Holdings to Frank Odom. $25,000. Dated 8 days before the petition was filed. Memo Line Consulting Services. Your Honor, Caroline said, I also have the wire transfer confirming that Mr. Odom received $25,000 from the petitioner's company in exchange for this evaluation. The sound that came from Diana's direction was small and strangled, not quite a word, not quite a cry, but something in between. Holloway looked at the bailiff. Take Mr. Odom into custody. He is under arrest for perjury and for filing a fraudulent instrument with this court. She watched the handcuffs go on with the expression of a woman recording a data point. Then she turned to Marcus Hale, whose documents were no longer arranged in a neat stack. Counselor, she said, your primary witness has just been arrested in my courtroom. I strongly suggest you consider what you'd like to do next very carefully. Hale stood up with the composure of a man deciding how to pretend his entire case hadn't just left the room in handcuffs. Your Honor, the petitioners would like to call Mr. Richard Mercer to the stand. Holloway raised one eyebrow. Your primary witness was just arrested for perjury, and you'd like your client to testify. We believe Mr. Mercer can speak to his genuine concerns for the respondent's welfare. Holloway looked at Caroline. Any objection, Miss Webb? Caroline rose halfway. None whatsoever, Your Honor. She sat back down and picked up her pen. Still. Ready. Richard walked to the stand with his chin up the walk of a man who had spent 20 years selling people on the idea that confidence and legitimacy were the same thing. He sat down and looked at the judge. Not at me. Hale kept it gentle. Mr. Mercer, in your own words, why did you file this petition? Because I care about my father-in-law. Richard's voice was warm, practiced. We watched him become confused, isolated. After the medical incident, he ended up in the ER alone at 3 in the morning without telling anyone. That's when Diana and I knew we couldn't wait. And the purpose of the petition, to protect him. That's all this has ever been. Hale sat down, looking relieved. Caroline stood. She didn't move right away. She looked at Richard, the way you look at something you've already measured and found wanting. Then she walked forward, slow and deliberate. Mr. Mercer, you testified that my client is confused about his finances. That's correct. Is that why 3 weeks ago you asked him for $800,000? The temperature in the room dropped. Richard's jaw tightened. I offered him an investment opportunity. You asked a man you believed to be financially confused for $800,000. Caroline said, her voice still conversational, which made it worse. Guaranteed 50% return in 6 months. That's what you told him. The project is fundamentally sound. Austin Pinnacle Tower is $75 million over budget. 22 contractors have filed liens in Travis County. Apex Ridge Capital issued an $8 million capital call 7 days ago that you have not paid. She stopped. Is that a strong investment, Mr. Mercer? Richard's knuckles went white on the railing. He looked at Hale. Hale gave him nothing. There have been temporary challenges. You're bankrupt. 3 words. Flat and final as a closed door. No liquidity? Frozen credit? Personally liable for the full Apex Ridge default. She stepped closer. So where did you find the cash to retain this law firm, pay Frank Odom $25,000, and file this petition against a man you claim to love? Richard's mouth opened. His chest rose and fell. His eyes cut to Diana, fast, involuntary, the look of a man calculating how much room he has left. Caroline turned to the projector. 2 bank transfers appeared on the wall, sharp, irrefutable. $210,000 to Mercer Property Holdings, $130,000 to Houston Premier Events LLC, a company registered 4 months ago in Stafford, Texas, whose sole owner is you. She turned back. $340,000 from the Maggie Kane Foundation, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Named after your wife's deceased mother. Diana's hand came up to her mouth. You told me those were administrative fees. Her voice split down the middle. She was on her feet without appearing to have stood. You told me the board approved them. Diana, Richard started, then turned back to the bench, his voice cracking at the edges. You used her name. Her voice broke completely raw and fractured, and past any pretense of composure. You used my mother's name, Richard, Mrs. Mercer. Holloway's voice was firm. Please sit down. Diana sat. Her hands shook on the table. She stared at her husband with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was 9 years old. The look of someone who has just discovered the world is worse than they believed. Richard turned back to the bench. His desperation hardened into something uglier. He raised a trembling finger and pointed it at me. It's his fault. His voice cracked. All of it. He had the money. He sat there and said no, and he made me do this. He made us... Mr. Mercer! Holloway's voice landed like a door closing. You are under oath. Lower your hand, now. He lowered it. His chest heaved. He looked at me across the room, across the tables, past Caroline, past Diana, still trembling with the eyes of a man who has watched himself lose everything and needs someone else to carry the weight of it. I looked back at him and did not look away. I waited because the next part was mine. Judge Holloway looked at me across the wreckage of the petitioner's table. Richard sat with his hands pressed against his forehead, breathing the way men breathe when they're trying to hold themselves together. Diana sat beside him, not touching him, staring at nothing. Mr. Kane, Holloway said, the petition remains before this court. Do you have anything to say regarding your competency? I stood up. No notes, no papers. Hands loose at my sides, the same posture I'd held in every Senate chamber and federal hearing room for 31 years. Thank you, Your Honor. But I'm not here to argue my competency. I paused. I came here to file a criminal complaint and to collect a debt. Hale jumped up. Objection, improper venue. Sit down, Mr. Hale. Holloway didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You brought this man into my courtroom. The court will hear him. I turned to Diana first. She was watching me with the look of someone who has been running a long time and just realized there's nowhere left to go. $340,000 left the Maggie Kane Foundation, I said. Richard's companies received it, but the checks were signed by the foundation's managing director. I held her gaze. My daughter signed them, with full knowledge. That is a choice documented in her own handwriting, for which there will be consequences. Diana's chin dropped. Her hands pressed flat on the table. She held herself very still. I nodded to Carolyn. She crossed the aisle and set a bound document in front of Richard. He picked it up. His hands began to shake a fine, uncontrollable tremor. He pressed the papers against the table to stop. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. "An emergency notice of foreclosure and seizure," I said. "Your loan with Apex Ridge Capital as of midnight last night, I own it. You are not in default to Apex Ridge anymore, Richard. You are in default to me." The color came back to his face, but wrong, blotchy, uneven. "You can't. Standard debt assignment. Completely legal." I took 3 steps toward his table and stopped. "The River Oaks property. Mine, the 3 vehicles. Mine. Mercer Development Group and all associated holdings. Mine." I paused. "And the land the mansion sits on, which you've been leasing from me for 8 years at $1 per year because you signed a contract you never read carefully enough, that was always mine." The sound Richard made had no word in it. Just air leaving a man whose body understood something his mind was still refusing. 8 years, I said quietly. Your mansion, your pool, your home theater, all of it on 3.2 acres that belonged to me. Holloway watched with the expression of a woman who had presided over a great many proceedings and had never seen one end quite like this. I turned back to the bench. "One final matter, Your Honor." I set a thin folder on the bench. "I've forwarded a complete tax fraud file on Mercer Development Group to IRS Criminal Investigation. My former colleagues send their regards." The gallery was silent. I looked at Richard one last time. He was staring at the foreclosure notice the way a man stares at his own obituary, trying to find the error, finding none. "You came after a retired old man," I said low enough that only the front of the room could hear. "You should have checked what he retired from." I sat down. Holloway set her reading glasses on the bench. "The petition for conservatorship is denied. Motion dismissed." She looked toward the back row where a woman in a dark blazer had been sitting quietly for 40 minutes with a notepad. "Miss Pryor, I believe you have some work to do." The woman stood, clipped her notepad shut, and nodded once. A man who confesses his crimes in open court under oath in front of a sitting judge while pointing his finger at someone else and calling it their fault does not leave himself many legal options. Richard tried anyway. He hired a new attorney. A better one, which meant a more expensive one, which meant money he didn't have, which meant the retainer came from somewhere none of us could immediately identify, and the DA's office added it to their growing list of questions. The new attorney filed 2 motions to suppress the financial evidence Carolyn had presented, argued that the bank transfer records had been obtained improperly, and requested a continuance on the grounds that the original hearing had been procedurally prejudiced by the judge's prior professional relationship with the respondent. Judge Holloway denied all 3 motions in a single order that ran to 4 paragraphs and did not waste words. Richard refused the plea agreement the DA offered 8 years in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. His attorney, to his credit, told him plainly, that refusing was a mistake. Richard told his attorney that he had built a 9-figure business from nothing, and he was not going to let a retired pencil pusher take it away from him in a plea bargain. They took him to trial in November. The jury was out for less than 3 hours. 11 counts. Wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343 securities fraud, aggravated embezzlement of charitable funds, and 4 counts of tax fraud conspiracy. The charges that had come back from my former colleagues at IRS Criminal Investigation, with a thoroughness that told me someone at the division had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of referral. The judge, a man named Whitfield, who had no prior relationship with anyone in the room, looked at Richard Mercer, a man who had tried to declare his elderly father-in-law legally incompetent in order to loot a dead woman's scholarship fund and save his own collapsing empire, and sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison. 12 years. No early release recommendation. No minimum security designation. Richard Allen Mercer, who had spent 46 years of his life selling people on the idea that he was the smartest man in every room he entered, was going to spend the next 12 of them in a room he had not chosen and could not leave. I did not attend the sentencing. I did not need to. Diana was harder. She was indicted 3 weeks after Richard on 1 count of felony misappropriation of charitable funds and 1 count of conspiracy. Her attorney, a woman named Sandra Greer, who specialized in white-collar defense and had the reputation of being both very good and very honest with her clients, advised Diana that the evidence against her was airtight, that the signatures were hers, and that the only variable remaining was how the judge would weigh her cooperation and circumstances against the severity of what she had done. Diana pleaded guilty. At sentencing, her attorney presented testimony about Richard's controlling behavior, his management of the household finances, and the degree to which Diana had been isolated from independent counsel for years. The judge listened carefully. He also looked at the emails, the January thread, Diana's message, "He's 73, and he's lonely, trust me," and he weighed what he heard against what was documented. He sentenced her to 4 years of formal probation, full restitution of the $340,000 to the Maggie Kane Foundation, and 2,500 hours of mandatory community service. The service assignment was not highway cleanup or filing in a government office. It was Glenwood Memory Care, the locked ward specifically, where patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease and dementia lived out their days in the careful, unglamorous work of being cared for by strangers. The judge was direct about his reasoning. A woman who had attempted to weaponize cognitive decline against a man who did not have it would spend the next 2 years providing genuine care to people who did. I thought it was a just sentence. I thought it was perhaps the first genuinely educational experience my daughter had received since the 4th grade. In December, I sold the River Oaks properties at auction, the main house and the guest house, and all 3.2 acres of the land they sat on. The proceeds split cleanly into 2 portions. The first $2.1 million went directly into the Maggie Kane Foundation under new professional management, a board of trustees with no family members, and a mandate to distribute every dollar to the Houston Independent School District students Maggie had spent her life teaching. The second portion, $2.5 million, went into a trust for Connor. Locked until his 25th birthday, managed by a fiduciary I had vetted carefully with a single instruction attached. Use it for something that lasts. I signed the trust documents in Caroline's office on a Thursday afternoon in December. Outside the window, Houston was doing its version of winter, 53 degrees, and gray, the bayou running high from a week of rain. I signed my name at the bottom of the last page, and Caroline witnessed it, and the notary stamped it, and that was done. On the way out, I stopped in the lobby and called Connor. He answered on the second ring. "Grandpa, how's the knee?" He'd taken a hit in the St. Thomas game. I had been in the front row as promised, and I had watched the hit, and I had not looked away. "Better," he said. "Coach says I'm good for Friday." "Good," I said. "Connor, I wanted you to know that I've set something aside for you. You'll hear about it when the time is right." A pause. "Grandpa, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," I said. "That's not why I did it." I pushed through the lobby door into the gray December afternoon. "Your grandmother would have wanted you to have something solid under your feet. I'm just making sure you do." The line was quiet for a moment. When Connor spoke again, his voice was lower, rougher at the edges. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." I stood on the sidewalk outside Carolyn's office building, the cold Houston wind finding its way through my jacket, and looked up at the overcast sky. "Go win on Friday," I said. 3 months later, she came. It was a Saturday morning in March. Houston couldn't decide what season it wanted to be: cool air, warm sun, and the magnolias in Herman Park already putting out their first blooms. I had been up since 5:30 with my coffee and the crossword, the way I always was now, in the particular quiet of a man who has learned to need less. The knock came at 8:47, 3 light taps. A pause. I knew it was her before I reached the door. She was wearing a faded blue volunteer's smock with Glenwood Memory Care embroidered above the pocket. No makeup. Hair pulled back plain. Her hands, the one vanity she and Maggie had shared, were red and rough at the knuckles. She looked hollowed out in the way that means something unnecessary has been removed. "Come in," I said. She stepped inside and looked around without commenting on the size of the apartment. The old Diana would have said something helpful and cutting about that. This Diana walked to the window and looked out at the park. "Why?" she said. Her voice had lost its careful modulation. What came out was quieter and entirely unmanaged. "Why, what you knew from June." She turned from the window, eyes dry at real cost. "You could have stopped us before I signed anything. If I had stopped you in July." I said, "What would you have learned?" She opened her mouth, closed it. "You would have called me paranoid," I said. "You would have believed Richard's next explanation. You would have found another way to get him the money." I looked at her steadily. "I didn't let you do anything, Diana. I let you be exactly who you were. The only way you were ever going to see it clearly was to live all the way through it." A muscle worked in her jaw. She turned back to the window. "I read the email," I said. "January. He's 73 and he's lonely. That was you, not Richard." My voice stayed level, not cruel, just factual. "You started this." Her breath shook at its edges. "I know," she said, barely audible. "I know I did." I walked to my desk. In the bottom left drawer was a small envelope I had been carrying since the week Maggie died off. White, slightly yellowed, sealed with the kind of care that means someone pressed it closed with both hands and held it there. Maggie's handwriting on the front. "For Diana. When the time is right." 6 years I had been deciding when that was. I held it out. Diana crossed the room and took it carefully, the way you take something that might break. She opened it. I watched her face as she read, watched the careful blankness she had been maintaining dissolve slowly, and then all at once. Maggie had written 4 sentences. "Diana, your father is the strongest man I have ever known. Not because he never broke, but because every time he did, he put himself back together for us. Don't mistake his silence for weakness. It never was. Mom." Diana pressed the letter flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes. The tears she had been holding back for 8 months came out of her in a sound with no performance in it at all, raw and broken and completely honest. I did not move toward her. It was not all right yet, and she deserved the honesty of that. I stood by my desk and let her cry until the worst of it passed through her, the way she had cried in the back seat of my car 34 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in October. When it quieted, I walked to the counter and picked up the second envelope. She took it. Inside, a card with an address on Dunleavy Street. Studio apartment 12 minutes from Glenwood by bus. 3 months' rent paid. A Metro Transit card. After that, I said, "You're on your own." She looked at the card. Then she looked up at me, searching for something. Forgiveness, maybe. Or just her father. I gave her what I had, the particular kind of love that doesn't soften the truth, but stays in the room while you face it. "The ledger is clear," I said. She nodded, folded both envelopes into her smock pocket, walked to the door and left without looking back, not because she didn't want to, but because she had finally understood that the next step had to be forward. I stood at the window and watched the magnolias move in the morning wind. Then I picked up my coffee, cold by now, and drank it anyway. I sat down in the single chair by the window, the only chair the right number, and let the morning come in. My name is Walter Kane. I have retired twice, the first time from the work, the second time from being invisible. The books are balanced, and for the first time in longer than I can honestly remember, I am not waiting for anything. I've been sitting with this story for a long time. Longer than I've told anyone. People ask me what I learned from all of it, from the Sunday dinners where I was invisible, from the hospital at 3 in the morning, from the courtroom, from Diana's face when she read her mother's letter. And the honest answer is this. I learned that silence is not the same as peace. For 10 years I confused the two. I told myself I was being patient, being gracious, being the bigger man. What I was actually doing was giving everyone around me permission to treat me as less than I was. Don't do what I did. Don't let the people you love or the people you simply share a roof with mistake your kindness for absence of limits. The ledger always balances eventually. The only question is whether you're the one holding the pen when it does. I believe God gave us dignity for a reason. Not to spend it quietly in a corner waiting for someone to notice. To stand in it. Even at 73. Especially at 73. If this Grandpastory's revenge story moved something in you, if you've ever sat at the far end of a long table and felt like a piece of furniture nobody knew where to put, then you already understand what this family revenge cost and what it gave back. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that real strength is knowing when to finally pick up the pen, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. To everyone who stayed until the end, thank you. Genuinely. The Grandpastory's and family revenge story you're about to encounter in future videos contains some fictional elements built entirely for the purpose of reflection and education. If that's not for you, that's completely okay. Step away, find what serves you better. We'll be here when you're ready.